Mother Bobcat with 3 cubs begs this human baby to be let into the home. What the baby did made everyone cry. Let us know where you're watching from, and don't forget to like and subscribe if you love our content. The first winter storm of the season swept across the foothills of the Blue Ridge Mountains, bringing with it a bone-chilling cold that seeped through the walls of the Harrison family's remote cabin. Inside, Jack Harrison stoked the fire, adding another log to keep the bitter wind at bay, while his wife Melissa gently rocked their 6-month-old daughter Emma in her arms, humming a soft lullaby that had been passed down through generations of her family. Their cabin stood nestled against the edge of Pisgah National Forest in western North Carolina, a deliberate choice they'd made 3 years ago when Jack returned from his final tour of duty in Afghanistan. The isolation had been healing for him. The quiet forest, a stark contrast to the chaos of war that still occasionally haunted his dreams. Here, miles from the nearest neighbor, he had slowly found his way back to himself. And now, with Melissa and baby Emma, the small cabin had become more than just a refuge. It had become a home. "Storm's picking up," Jack said, glancing through the frost-covered window as the wind howled outside, bending the tall pines until they groaned under the weight of sleet and ice. "I better check the generator before we lose power." Melissa nodded, carefully laying Emma down in her wooden crib, a beautiful piece Jack had crafted himself during the long months of Melissa's pregnancy. She pulled a hand-knitted blanket over the sleeping infant and brushed a finger against her rosy cheek. "Be quick," she said, a slight frown creasing her forehead. "I don't like the sound of tonight. Something feels different." Jack paused at her words. In their years together, he'd learned to trust Melissa's intuition. She'd grown up in these mountains, had developed a sense for when something wasn't quite right in the rhythms of the forest around them. He reached for his heavy canvas jacket and the flashlight they kept charged by the door. As he zipped up his coat, a strange silence suddenly fell over the forest. The howling wind died down, and the distant calls of night birds ceased completely. Jack froze, his hand on the doorknob, his body instinctively tensing in the way it had during night patrols in distant deserts. "Did you hear that?" he asked, his voice barely audible. Melissa moved to his side, straining to listen. At first, there was nothing but the soft crackling of the fire and the occasional pop of sap from the burning pine logs. Then they heard it, a strange chirping sound, followed by what could only be described as a guttural yowl. Not the haunting call of an owl or the distant howl of a coyote, but something more desperate, more deliberate. "Probably just a fox," Jack said, but his voice lacked conviction. The hand that wasn't on the doorknob instinctively moved toward the cabinet where he kept his hunting rifle. Before his fingers could touch the wood, a distinct thud against the cabin wall made them both jump. Emma stirred in her crib but didn't wake. The thud came again, this time accompanied by a scraping sound that raked along the outer logs of the cabin wall. Melissa rushed to the window, her heart hammering in her chest. What she saw made her gasp. Through the swirling sleet, illuminated by the security light they'd installed the previous summer, stood the sleek, tawny form of a bobcat. The wild feline was up on its hind legs, front paws braced against the side of the cabin. But it wasn't alone. Huddled beneath a small overhang created by their woodpile were 3 small, spotted kittens, bobcat cubs clearly young and vulnerable in the harsh winter storm. "Jack," Melissa whispered, unable to take her eyes off the scene. "There's a mother bobcat out there with 3 cubs." Jack joined her at the window, his face reflecting surprise and caution. "That's not all," he said, pointing to the side. "Look at her back leg." Melissa shifted her gaze and felt her stomach tighten. The mother bobcat's right hind leg had what appeared to be a metal trap clamped around it, the chain trailing behind. Her in the snow, clearly broken off from whatever had anchored it. The leg was swollen and matted with blood, yet somehow the injured animal had managed to travel through the storm with her cubs, seeking shelter at the only human dwelling for miles. As they watched in stunned silence, the bobcat lowered herself to all fours, limping noticeably as she moved back to her cubs. She didn't hiss or show any signs of aggression. Instead, she simply settled into the snow, her cubs huddling against her for warmth, and stared directly at the cabin window, her amber eyes reflecting the security light with an almost supernatural glow. "What does she want?" Melissa whispered, though something in her already knew the answer. Before Jack could respond, Emma woke with a startled cry. The sound carried through the cabin and out into the snowy night. At the sound of the human baby's cries, something remarkable happened. The mother bobcat tilted her head, her triangular ears perking up and swiveling forward. Then, as Melissa and Jack watched in disbelief, she let out a soft, chirping sound, a vocalization that eerily mimicked the cries of their daughter. It was in that moment that Melissa understood. These weren't just random wild animals seeking shelter from the storm. Somehow, they had come here deliberately, driven by something more powerful than instinct alone. They had come with a purpose. "Jack," Melissa said softly, her eyes never leaving the bobcat family, "I think she needs our help." Jack gripped the edge of the windowsill, his knuckles turning white. As a former Army Ranger, he'd been trained to assess threats and make split-second decisions, but nothing in his military experience had prepared him for this. "Melissa," he said, his voice tense, "that's a wild bobcat with cubs. Do you understand what you're saying? They're predators, dangerous ones." Melissa moved away from the window, going to Emma, who continued to fuss in her crib. The baby's cries grew louder, and outside, the mother bobcat made that strange chirping sound again, followed by what could only be described as a plaintive yowl. "Listen to that," Melissa whispered. "She's responding to Emma. I've never heard of bobcats behaving." "This way." Jack ran his fingers through his hair, a habit from his military days when he was struggling with a difficult decision. "That doesn't make them any less dangerous. A cornered wild animal, especially one that's injured and protecting its young, is one of the most unpredictable things in nature." Melissa picked up Emma, cradling her close. The baby's cries softened as she felt her mother's warmth. "Look at them again, Jack," she urged. "Really look. They're not acting aggressive, they're waiting." Jack reluctantly returned to the window. The sleet had turned to heavy snow now, almost obscuring their view. But the bobcat family remained, their tawny forms stark against the white landscape. The mother bobcat was attempting to groom the injured leg, wincing visibly as her rough tongue contacted the metal trap still embedded in her flesh. "She's hurt badly, Jack," Melissa said, joining him at the window with Emma in her arms. "And look how thin they all are. Those cubs can't be more than a few months old. They should be in a warm den, not out in this storm." "Someone's been setting illegal traps," Jack reasoned, his voice softening slightly. "She must have gotten caught and managed to break the chain, but not free herself from the trap itself." A sharp crack echoed through the forest, the sound of a distant tree branch breaking under the weight of ice. The bobcat family flinched but didn't run. Instead, they huddled closer together, the mother positioning herself protectively around her cubs. "We can't just leave them out there," Melissa said firmly, the resolve clear in her voice. She had always been the more openly compassionate of the two, though Jack's protective nature came from the same place of care, just expressed differently through caution. Jack stared at her incredulously. "What exactly are you suggesting? That we invite a family of wild bobcats into our home with our baby daughter?" Melissa shook her head. "No, not into the house, but maybe the workshop. It's insulated, empty except for your tools. They could shelter there until the storm passes and we figure out how to help with that trap." "Melissa," "This is crazy," Jack protested, though his voice had lost some of its edge. "We don't know why they're here or what they might do." Another sharp crack sounded from the forest, closer this time. The mother bobcat rose to her feet, facing the direction of the sound. She let out a low, warning growl, then turned back to the cabin window where Melissa stood with Emma. What happened next left both Jack and Melissa speechless. The bobcat approached the cabin again, but this time she gently pushed one of her cubs forward with her nose. The small kitten stumbled through the snow until it was pressed against the cabin wall beneath their window. Then the bobcat did something that defied everything they knew about wild animals. She bowed her head, almost as if in supplication, and looked directly at Melissa with an intensity that transcended species. "She's begging, Jack," Melissa whispered, her voice filled with wonder and certainty. "She's asking us to help her babies." Jack was silent for a long moment, the internal struggle visible on his face. His years in combat had taught him to be wary of the unexpected, to see potential threats where others might not. But those same years had also taught him about courage, about the bond that forms when lives depend on one another. Something in the bobcat's desperate plea resonated with a part of him he thought he'd left behind in the dust and danger of war, the part that recognized suffering and couldn't turn away from it. "The workshop has that separate entrance from the side," he finally said, his decision made. "I could open the door, put down some old blankets, and leave them to come in on their own terms." No direct contact. Relief flooded through Melissa as she reached out to squeeze his hand. "Thank you," she said simply. "But you and Emma stay inside with the doors locked," he insisted, retrieving his flashlight and pulling on his thickest gloves. "If anything goes wrong, anything at all, you call emergency services and get to the storm cellar through the kitchen." Melissa nodded, though something deep inside told her she had nothing to fear from these particular wild creatures. As Jack prepared to go outside into the worsening storm, she returned to the window. The bobcat family remained where they were, gradually being covered by the falling snow. The cubs shivered visibly, huddling against their mother, who maintained her vigilant watch on the cabin. "Be careful," Melissa called to Jack as he slipped out the back door into the swirling snow. What neither of them realized was that their act of compassion that stormy night was about to change their lives forever in ways they could never have imagined. Jack moved carefully around the side of the cabin, his boots crunching through the deep snow. The wind had picked up again, whipping ice crystals against his face as he made his way toward the workshop. He kept the beam of his flashlight aimed downward, creating pools of light that guided each cautious step. The weight of his decision pressed upon him with each footfall. He had survived 3 tours in Afghanistan by trusting his instincts, by identifying threats before they materialized. Now those same instincts were pulling him in opposite directions. The soldier in him recognizing potential danger, the man responding to something deeper that he couldn't quite name. When he rounded the corner, he froze, his breath catching in his throat. Reading about bobcats was one thing, seeing one from the safety of a window was another. But standing less than 15 feet from a wild bobcat and her cubs sent a primal fear through his body. Every military instinct screamed at him to retreat, to protect his family from these unpredictable predators. The mother bobcat noticed him immediately. She rose slightly, her amber eyes reflecting the beam of his flashlight. Her ears flattened against her head in a clear display of wariness. The metal trap on her hind leg gleamed dully, a cruel reminder of human intrusion into her world. Behind her, the 3 cubs huddled together, their spotted coats dusted with snow, their eyes wide with a mixture of fear and curiosity. "Easy," Jack whispered, though whether to himself or the bobcat he wasn't sure. "I'm here to help." To his amazement, the bobcat lowered herself back down, her ears relaxing slightly, though her gaze remained fixed on him. She made no move to retreat or to attack. seemingly assessing his intentions with an intelligence that surprised him. Jack took a slow step forward, then another. He gestured toward the workshop, a small, sturdy structure he had built the previous spring. "This way," he said, keeping his voice low and even, knowing the animal couldn't understand his words, but hoping his tone might communicate something. "There's shelter for you and your little ones." The bobcat tilted her head, then looked back at her cubs. After what seemed like an eternity, she made a soft, chirping sound that caused the cubs to stir from their huddled position. Then, with painful slowness due to her injured leg, she began to limp through the snow, pausing every few steps to ensure her cubs were following. "That's it," Jack encouraged, taking another step toward the workshop. "It's not far." To his astonishment, the small family began to follow him, not charging, not threatening, but moving cautiously through the snow. The mother kept her cubs between herself and the workshop wall, creating a buffer between them and the strange human leading the way. Inside the cabin, Melissa watched through the kitchen window. Emma clutched tightly to her chest. Her heart pounded as she saw her husband leading a family of bobcats through their backyard, as calmly as if they were stray house cats. It was surreal, impossible, yet it was happening before her eyes. Jack reached the workshop and fumbled with the keys, his fingers stiff from cold. The bobcat stopped several yards away, waiting. He finally got the door open and stepped aside, gesturing toward the entrance. The workshop was warm enough. A small, efficient space heater ran whenever temperatures dropped below freezing to protect his tools and supplies from damage. The mother bobcat approached first, cautiously sniffing the air. She poked her head inside the doorway, her whiskers twitching as she examined the unfamiliar space. After a moment, she entered, her cubs following closely. Once they were all inside, Jack closed the door partway, leaving it open just enough that they wouldn't feel trapped, but closed enough to keep out the worst of the storm. He hurried back to the cabin, half expecting to hear the sounds of the workshop, being torn apart by panicked wild animals. Instead, there was only silence except for the howling wind. "They went in?" Melissa asked incredulously as he stamped the snow from his boots in the mudroom. Jack nodded, still not quite believing it. Himself, like they knew exactly what I was offering. Melissa set Emma down in her bassinet and began gathering supplies, old blankets, a container of water, and some of the venison jerky Jack had made from last season's hunting. "They must be hungry and thirsty," she explained, seeing Jack's questioning. "Look, Melissa, you're not going out there," he said firmly, running a hand through his snow-dampened hair. "We can't just leave them like that," she countered, placing the supplies in a canvas bag. "The little ones looked half frozen, and that trap—" She held up a small first aid kit and a pair of heavy-duty wire cutters. "I've treated injured animals before." It was true. Before they'd moved to the cabin, Melissa had volunteered at a wildlife rehabilitation center. She'd helped with everything from orphaned raccoon kits to injured birds of prey. But bobcats were different. Wild, potentially. Dangerous predators with powerful claws and teeth designed to bring down prey. "These aren't squirrels or rabbits," he reminded her gently. "That mother will do anything to protect her cubs if she feels threatened." Melissa placed her hand on his arm, her eyes meeting his with a certainty that made his protests die in his throat. "They're mothers, Jack, just like me. She needs help or she wouldn't be here." Before he could argue further, a sharp sound split the night. Not the crack of breaking branches this time, but something unmistakably human. A voice carried on the wind, followed by the distinct beam of a powerful spotlight sweeping across. "The trees at the edge of their property. Someone's out there," Jack said, moving quickly to the window. Through the swirling snow, he could make out the wavering beams of flashlights moving through the forest. "At least 2 people. Trappers," Melissa whispered, her voice hardening, "looking for their missing catch." Jack's jaw tightened. Trapping was regulated by strict seasons and permissions in these mountains, but there were always those who ignored the laws, setting their snares and traps where they shouldn't be, capturing protected species or using illegal methods. The metal trap on the bobcat's leg had told him everything he needed to know about what kind of people were now approaching his home. "Stay here with Emma," he said, reaching for his rifle. It wasn't a request, and Melissa recognized the tone. It was the voice of the soldier, the protector emerging from behind the quiet demeanor of the man she'd married. "What are you going to do?" she asked, picking up Emma, who had begun to fuss. "Just going to have a conversation," Jack replied, checking that the rifle was loaded before slinging it over his shoulder. "Make sure they understand they're trespassing on private property." He stepped out into the storm again, leaving Melissa alone with their daughter. Through the window, she watched his tall figure disappear into the swirling snow, moving toward the approaching lights. The minutes stretched like hours as she waited, gently rocking Emma while straining to hear anything above the howling wind. In the workshop, the Bobcat family had arranged themselves in the far corner. The mother sat alert, ears swiveling at every sound, while her cubs explored their temporary sanctuary with cautious curiosity. The injured leg was held carefully off the ground, the metal teeth of the trap still cruelly embedded in the flesh. Despite her predicament, there was a dignity in the way the wild mother watched over her young, a fierce determination that transcended pain and fear. Outside, Jack moved deliberately through the snow, his rifle visible but pointed downward. As he approached the lights, 3 men emerged from the tree line, dressed in heavy hunting gear, their faces partially obscured by scarves and the driving snow. "Evening," Jack called out, his voice carrying across the clearing between them. "You're on private property." The men paused, clearly surprised to encounter someone in the middle of the storm. The leader, a tall man with a bushy beard visible beneath his scarf, stepped forward. "Didn't mean no trespass," he said, his tone affable enough, though his eyes remained calculating. "We're tracking an animal, got loose from one of our sets." "Your sets," Jack repeated, letting skepticism color his voice. "Trapping season ended 6 weeks ago." The bearded man's expression hardened slightly. "Just cleaning up. Had a few traps out we forgot about. Heard there was a bobcat with a valuable pelt in these parts. Worth good money. Nothing to clean up. On my property," Jack replied evenly. "I haven't seen any animals around here tonight. Storm like this, they'd be denned up somewhere far from here." The youngest of the 3 men, barely more than a teenager, shifted uncomfortably. "But we followed tracks right to—" "Shut up, Devin," the bearded man snapped, then turned back to Jack with a forced smile. "Sorry to bother you. We'll head back." "To the road," Jack nodded, remaining where he stood as the 3 men turned to leave. He watched until their lights disappeared back into the forest. But something in their easy retreat left him uneasy. They had given up too quickly, accepted his lie too readily. Back at the cabin, Melissa had prepared a bundle of supplies to take to the workshop. When Jack returned, stamping snow from his boots, she could see the tension in his shoulders. "Trappers?" she asked, adjusting Emma in her carrier. "3 of them," Jack confirmed, setting his rifle aside. "Looking for our bobcat. I told them I hadn't seen anything, but I don't think they believed me. They're probably circling around to approach from another direction." Melissa's face hardened. With resolve. All the more reason to help her now. If that trap stays on much longer, she could lose the leg. Even if she escapes the trappers, she'd never be able to hunt effectively to provide for her cubs. Jack knew she was right. He looked at the bundle of supplies she'd gathered, then at Emma secured in her carrier against Melissa's chest. "I'll take those out there. You stay here with Emma." Melissa shook her head firmly. "She's more likely to trust another mother. I've worked with injured predators before, Jack. I know how to approach them without triggering defensive aggression." "Melissa, I'll be careful," she promised, "and you'll be right there with me. Emma will be fine. She needs to be wherever I am anyway. She gets fussy if I'm gone too long, and the last thing we need is a crying baby in the house while we're trying to work with wild animals in the workshop. Jack recognized the determination in his wife's eyes. It was the same look she'd had when she told him she was moving to the mountains with him after his discharge. The same unwavering resolve she'd shown throughout her difficult pregnancy. He sighed, knowing from experience that once Melissa made up her mind, especially about helping an animal in need, there would be no changing it. "You stay behind me at all times," he conceded. "First sign of aggression, we're out of there." Melissa nodded, relieved that he understood. Together, they bundled up against the storm and made their way to the workshop, Jack carrying the supplies while Melissa kept Emma protected against her chest beneath her heavy coat. The baby had fallen asleep, lulled by her mother's warmth and the gentle swaying of their walk. Jack opened the workshop door slowly, letting the light from his flashlight sweep the interior before entering. The bobcats had arranged themselves in the corner farthest from the door. The mother sat alert, watching the entrance, while her cubs huddled behind her, their spotted coats blending together in the dim light. "Stay behind me," Jack whispered, entering first. The mother bobcat made a low sound in her throat. Not quite a growl, but definitely a warning. Jack stopped, holding up his empty hands to show he meant no harm. Melissa peered around him, her breath catching at the sight of the wild family up and close. The mother bobcat's amber eyes seemed to glow in the beam of the flashlight, her gaze moving from Jack to Melissa, then fixing on the slight bulge beneath Melissa's coat where Emma was secured. Slowly, deliberately, Melissa unzipped her coat just enough to reveal Emma's sleeping face. The baby's features were peaceful, her tiny lips slightly parted as she breathed the deep, regular rhythm of infant sleep. The effect on the mother bobcat was immediate and astonishing. Her posture relaxed slightly, her ears moving forward from their flattened position. She made a soft chirping sound, similar to what they had heard outside, a sound that reminded Melissa of the quiet vocalization she used when soothing Emma. "She recognizes what Emma is," Melissa whispered in wonder. "She knows I'm a mother too." Taking advantage of the moment, Melissa carefully set down the supplies Jack had carried. She opened the container of water and placed it within reach of the bobcats, then unwrapped the venison jerky, breaking it into smaller pieces that she scattered nearby. Finally, she set down the blankets, pushing them toward the animals with her foot. The mother bobcat watched, but made no move toward the offerings. One of the cubs tried to approach the food, but she gently herded it back with her nose. "She's being cautious," Jack observed. "Smart." The injured leg caught the beam of his flashlight, and they could see clearly now how badly the metal trap had damaged the flesh. The leg was swollen to nearly twice its normal size, the fur matted with dried blood, and the metal teeth deeply embedded in the muscle. "I need to look at that leg," Melissa said softly. "She's going to lose it if we don't get that trap off soon." Jack shook his head. "That's pushing our luck too far." But Melissa was already taking a slow, careful step forward, her eyes on the mother bobcat. "It's okay," she said in the same gentle tone she used with injured animals at the rehabilitation center. "I just want to help." The bobcat shifted uneasily, but didn't growl or show signs of aggression. Encouraged, Melissa took another careful step, then another, until she was close enough to see the injury clearly. "She escaped from a coney bear trap," Melissa told Jack, her voice tight with controlled anger. "It's designed to kill instantly by breaking the neck or spine. She must have sprung it with her leg instead of her head. They're illegal for bobcats in this state." As if confirming her words, the mother bobcat did something extraordinary. She extended her injured leg slightly toward Melissa, then looked directly into her eyes with what could only be described as a plea for help. Melissa's heart ached at the trust being shown to her, a wild animal deliberately exposing its vulnerability. With steady hands, born from years of working with injured wildlife, she knelt down in the workshop, just a few feet from the Bobcat family. "Jack," she whispered, "I need the wire cutters and the first aid kit." Jack hesitated, his protective instincts warring with the extraordinary scene before him. The bobcat wasn't acting like any wild predator he'd ever encountered or read about. Her eyes remained fixed on Melissa, showing intelligence and desperation rather than fear or aggression. "This isn't normal bobcat behavior," he said softly, even as he reached for the supplies. "No wild predator should let a human this close to her cubs." Melissa took the wire cutters with her right hand, keeping her movements slow and deliberate. Maybe she knows she doesn't have a choice. Maybe she's smarter than we give her kind credit for. She gestured toward Emma, still sleeping peacefully, in her carrier. Or maybe it's because we have a baby too. She can sense that. The mother bobcat remained still as Melissa inched closer, holding the wire cutters where the animal could see them. "I'm going to help you," she said in a soothing tone. "This will hurt, but then it will feel better." Behind her, Jack maintained a watchful position, ready to intervene if the bobcat showed any signs of aggression. But the wild cat simply watched Melissa approach, her amber eyes never wavering, her 3 cubs now huddled together, their spotted faces peering cautiously at the humans. "I'll need to stabilize the trap while I cut it," Melissa explained to Jack, though her eyes never left the bobcat. "The release mechanism is jammed, so I'll have to cut through the metal." With infinite care, she positioned the wire cutters on the spring mechanism of the trap. The metal teeth were buried deep in the bobcat's flesh, the fur around the wound, matted with dried blood. The leg was swollen to nearly twice its normal size, a clear sign of infection setting in. "This is going to hurt her," Melissa said, her voice tight with concern. "She might lash out instinctively when I start cutting." Jack moved closer, ready to pull Melissa back if necessary. "Should I try to hold her somehow?" Melissa shook her head. "No, restraining her would just make her panic. Let her know what's coming. Talk to her." Jack felt ridiculous at the suggestion, but the intensity of the moment pushed aside his reservations. "We're going to get this off you," he said to the bobcat, keeping his voice low and steady. "It's going to hurt, but we're trying to help." Whether it was his tone or something deeper, the bobcat seemed to understand. She tensed, but made no move to retreat or attack as Melissa began working the wire cutters on the metal trap. The first cut was the hardest. The trap's spring mechanism resisted, forcing Melissa to apply significant pressure. The bobcat flinched as the metal shifted, a small whimper escaping her throat, but she remained remarkably still. Her cubs moved, restlessly behind her, sensing their mother's distress. "Good girl," Melissa murmured, adjusting her grip for the next cut. "You're being so brave." The wire cutters bit through the metal with a sharp snap, partially releasing the pressure on the bobcat's leg. The animal let out a small yowl, but still made no move to attack or flee. "One more cut," Melissa promised, repositioning the tool. Outside, the storm continued to rage, wind howling around the corners of the workshop. But inside, time seemed to stand still as human and wild animal engaged in a moment of extraordinary trust. The second cut came easier, the metal finally giving way with a sharp crack that echoed in the small space. Carefully, Melissa spread the now severed jaws of the trap and lifted it away from the wounded leg. The bobcat immediately pulled back the injured limb, instinctively curling it beneath her body, but not before Melissa had seen the full extent of the damage. The metal teeth had cut deep into muscle and possibly nicked bone. Without treatment, infection would almost certainly claim the leg or the bobcat's life. "I need to clean this wound and give her antibiotics," Melissa said, reaching for the first aid kit. And something for the pain. Jack handed her the supplies, his expression troubled. Melissa, we're crossing into dangerous territory here. Wildlife rehabilitation is one thing, but treating a wild predator without proper facilities or expertise... I know what I'm doing, Jack, she interrupted gently. I treated worse injuries at the center. Besides, look at her. She's asking for our help. The bobcat was indeed watching them intently, her injured leg still tucked protectively beneath her body, but her posture remained unthreatening. One of the cubs had ventured forward slightly, its curiosity apparently overcoming its fear. The little one was eyeing the pieces of venison jerky Melissa had scattered earlier. She needs to eat, Melissa observed. And so do her babies. She probably hasn't hunted properly since getting caught in that trap. Jack noticed how thin the mother bobcat appeared now that he looked more closely. Her sides showed visible ribs beneath the tawny fur, a stark contrast to the relatively plump condition of her cubs. She had been sacrificing her own nourishment to continue providing for her young. She must be a good mother, he said softly, surprised by the sudden lump in his throat. Melissa smiled slightly as she prepared a mixture of antibiotic ointment and pain-relieving salve. The best ones always are, no matter the species. The mother bobcat watched as Melissa prepared the treatment, her amber eyes following every movement. When Melissa approached again with the medication, the bobcat hesitated only briefly before slowly extending her injured leg once more. This will sting at first, Melissa warned, her voice maintaining that soothing cadence that seemed to calm both human babies and wild cubs alike. As she applied the medication, the bobcat tensed but allowed the treatment to continue. Melissa worked quickly but thoroughly, cleaning the deep puncture wounds with antiseptic before applying the medicated ointment. The final step was wrapping the leg with a light bandage, just enough to keep the wounds clean without restricting movement. There, Melissa said, sitting back on her heels. All done. The mother bobcat immediately pulled her leg back, examining the bandage with obvious curiosity. She sniffed it cautiously, then looked up at Melissa with an expression that seemed almost grateful. She'll need antibiotics internally too, Melissa told Jack. I have some in pill form back at the cabin. We can hide them in the jerky. Jack nodded, his earlier fears subsiding as he watched the remarkable interaction. His years in combat had taught him to read situations, to sense danger before it materialized. But he sensed no threat from this wild family, only desperation, intelligence, and now perhaps the first flickers of trust. A sudden noise outside made them all freeze. The bobcat's ears swiveled sharply, her body tensing as she herded her cubs back against the wall with a protective sweep of her tail. Jack moved to the window, keeping low as he peered through a small gap in the blinds. They're back, he whispered, catching sight of flashlight beams moving through the trees at the edge of their property. The trappers, 3 of them spreading, out around the cabin. Melissa's expression hardened as she gathered Emma closer. The baby was still asleep, unaware of the drama unfolding around her. What do they want? You already told them to leave. The bobcat, Jack replied grimly. They must have tracked her here despite what I said. That bearded one mentioned her pelt was valuable. A flash of anger crossed Melissa's face. They're not taking her, or her babies. The mother bobcat seemed to sense the change in atmosphere. She rose to her feet, testing her bandaged leg gingerly. It clearly still pained her, but the relief of having the trap removed allowed her to put some weight on it. She made a low, rumbling sound in her throat as she positioned herself between her cubs and the door. I need to go out there, Jack said, checking that his rifle was loaded. Make it clear they're not welcome on our property. Melissa caught his arm. Be careful, Jack. Men like that, men who would set illegal traps and hunt a mother with cubs, they don't care about laws or decency. His expression softened as he looked at his wife and daughter. I know, that's why I need to deal with this. Before he could say more, a sharp rap came at the workshop door. The bobcat family instantly retreated into the darkest corner, the mother's eyes reflecting the dim light like twin flames. "Harrison," a gruff voice called through the door. "We know you've got our Bobcat in there. We tracked it right to this building." Jack motioned for Melissa to stay back, then moved to the door, opening it just enough to face the intruders while blocking their view of the interior. The bearded man stood on the other side, flanked by his two companions. All three had rifles slung across their backs. "I told you before," Jack said evenly, "you're trespassing on private property." The bearded man smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "And I think you're harboring an animal we've been tracking for weeks. That cat's worth a lot of money to the right buyer. Exotic pet collectors pay top dollar for live cubs." "There's nothing here but my tools," Jack replied, his voice hardening. "And you need to leave. Now." "Look, soldier boy," the man said, noting Jack's military-style bearing. "We can do this the easy way or the hard way. That cat's got our trap on its leg. Legally, that makes it ours. You're interfering with our livelihood." Inside the workshop, Melissa had positioned herself protectively in front of the Bobcat family, Emma still secure in her carrier. The mother Bobcat watched the confrontation at the door, her body tense, but her behavior strikingly controlled. "Your trap is illegal," Jack countered. "Conibear traps aren't permitted for bobcats in this state, and trapping season ended 6 weeks ago, so you've got 2 violations already. Want to add trespassing and harassment to the list when I call the game?" "Warden?" The youngest member of the trio, Devin, the bearded man had called him, shifted uncomfortably. "Mike, maybe we should just go. There's other cats." "Shut up," the bearded man, Mike, snapped. Then his tone changed, becoming almost reasonable. "Look, Harrison, I'm trying to be neighborly here. How about this? We'll give you a cut. That cat and her cubs could bring in $5,000, maybe $6,000. We'll split it with you. All you have to do is step aside." Jack's expression remained impassive, but inside, his combat instincts were on high alert. These men weren't going to be reasoned with. They saw the Bobcat family as nothing more than commodity, a way to make quick money, no matter the cruelty involved. "My final answer is no," Jack said firmly. "And if you don't leave my property in the next 60 seconds, I'm calling both the sheriff and the game warden." Mike's face darkened with anger. "You're making a mistake, Harrison. People who live out in these woods all alone. Accidents happen to them all the time." The threat hung in the air between them, unmistakable in its implications. "Is that so?" Jack replied, his voice deceptively calm as he shifted slightly, allowing the men to see the rifle he held at his side. "Funny, I was just thinking the same. Ye thing." The standoff continued for several tense heartbeats, neither side willing to back down. Inside the workshop, Melissa held her breath, one hand on Emma's carrier, the other reaching for her phone to call for help if needed. The tension broke when a distant siren wailed through the night, growing gradually louder as it approached along the forest road. Mike's head snapped toward the sound, his expression shifting from anger to calculation. "This isn't over," he said finally, backing away from the door. "That cat's marked. We'll find her eventually." Jack remained in the doorway, watching as the 3 men retreated to their pickup truck parked just beyond the tree line. The siren grew louder, and soon the red and blue lights of a county sheriff's vehicle illuminated the swirling snow as it pulled into the Harrisons' long driveway. "Did you call them?" Jack asked Melissa as he stepped back into the workshop. She shook her head, equally confused. "No, I was just about to." The Bobcat family remained in their corner, the cubs now huddled behind their mother, who watched the door with intense focus. Despite her injury and the strange environment, she maintained a dignity and calm that seemed almost supernatural for a wild animal. Outside, a car door slammed, followed by crunching footsteps in the snow. A sharp knock came at the workshop door. "Mr. Harrison? It's Deputy Collins. Everything okay out here? We got a call about trespassers on your property." Jack opened the door to find a young deputy standing there, one hand resting casually on his holstered sidearm. Behind him, the trapper's truck was pulling away, disappearing into the swirling snow. "Who called you?" Jack asked, genuinely puzzled. The deputy consulted his notepad. "Anonymous tip. Someone called in saying 3 men were trespassing on your property with intent to poach. Given the storm, I was already patrolling this area to check for stranded motorists." Jack and Melissa exchanged bewildered glances. Who could have called? The nearest neighbor was miles away. "Well, they were here," Jack confirmed. 3 men claiming to be trappers, though they admitted they were operating out of season. They were looking for... He hesitated, unsure how. To explain the situation with the Bobcats. The deputy's eyes narrowed slightly. "Looking for what exactly?" Melissa made a quick decision. Stepping forward with Emma still secured against her chest, she spoke directly to the deputy. "They were after a family of bobcats that sought shelter from the storm. The mother is injured, caught in an illegal trap they set. We've been trying to help her." She braced herself for skepticism or legal warnings about interfering with wildlife, but to her surprise, the deputy simply nodded. "Figured it might be something like that," he said. "We've had reports of illegal trapping all through this area. Over the past month, game wardens are stretched thin with the storm." He peered past them into the workshop. "The animals are in there?" Jack nodded cautiously. "The mother has 3 cubs. She came to our cabin looking for help." Dawn arrived with gentle fingers of light stretching across the snow-covered landscape. The storm had passed during the night, leaving behind a transformed world of pristine white drifts and ice-jeweled trees that sparkled in the early morning sun. Inside the workshop, Jack stirred from his uncomfortable position in the wooden chair where he had insisted on keeping watch through the night. His back protested as he straightened, muscles stiff from hours of vigilance. Across the room, Melissa slept curled on a makeshift bed of blankets, Emma nestled securely against her. The baby had woken only twice during the night for feeding, settling quickly each time back into peaceful slumber. Jack's gaze shifted to their unusual guests. The Bobcat family had remained in their corner, the mother alert even in rest, her amber eyes opening instantly at his movement. "Good morning," he said softly, still marveling at how natural it felt to speak to the wild creature as if she might understand. The bobcat blinked slowly, then carefully rose to her feet, testing her bandaged leg. The difference from the previous night was remarkable. Though she still favored the limb, the swelling had visibly decreased, and she moved with greater confidence. Behind her, her cubs stirred, their spotted coats blending together in a pile of tawny fur and dark markings. Jack checked his watch, just past 7. The game warden would arrive soon to assess the situation. An unexpected pang of sadness touched him at the thought. Their extraordinary night of shared sanctuary would come to an end. The Bobcat family likely transferred to a wildlife rehabilitation facility until the mother healed completely. A soft knock at the workshop door caused the Bobcat to tense, her ears flattening slightly as she positioned herself in front of her cubs. Jack moved carefully to the door, opening it to find Deputy Collins standing in the early morning light. "Morning?" The deputy greeted him quietly, noticing the sleeping forms of Melissa and Emma. "Game warden's about 20 minutes out. Thought I'd check in first, see how our patients are doing." Jack stepped aside to allow the deputy a view of the Bobcat family. "Better than expected. The mother's already putting weight on the injured leg, and they all ate well last night." Deputy Collins observed the wild family with evident fascination. Never seen anything like this in 15 years of law enforcement. Bobcats approaching humans, letting themselves be treated. He shook his head in wonder. "My grandmother would... You say there's old magic at work?" "Maybe there is," Jack replied, surprised to find himself open to the idea. His military training and practical nature had always made him skeptical of anything that couldn't be logically explained. But the events of the past 12 hours had stretched his understanding of what was possible. Melissa stirred, waking to the quiet conversation. She blinked sleepily, then carefully sat up, mindful of Emma still sleeping against her. "Is the warden here?" she asked, her voice hushed. "On his way," Deputy Collins informed her. "Should be here shortly." Melissa's expression showed the same. Conflicted emotions Jack was feeling. Relief that professional help was coming. Sadness that their time with the remarkable Bobcat family would end. "They'll take good care of them," the deputy assured her, correctly reading her concern. "Our regional wildlife center has an excellent rehabilitation program. Once the mother is fully healed, they'll release the family back into protected wilderness, away from trappers," Melissa asked pointedly. Deputy Collins nodded firmly. "Far away. And speaking of which, we've got an APB out for Mike Donovan and his associates. Those Connie Bear traps are illegal for bobcats, and operating out of season carries significant penalties. The threats they made against you last night add another layer of charges." A sound from outside drew their attention, the crunch of tires on the snow-packed driveway. Through the window, they could see a state wildlife management vehicle approaching, its green and tan paint scheme identifying it as belonging to the Game Warden Service. "That'll be Warden Reyes," Deputy Collins said, moving toward the door. "I'll explain the situation to her first." As the deputy stepped outside, Jack moved to Melissa's side, helping her to her feet while she balanced Emma, who was beginning to wake. "How are you feeling?" he asked quietly. Melissa gazed at the Bobcat family, who were now all fully awake and watching the humans with alert attention. "Like we've experienced something few people ever get to witness, something special." Jack nodded, understanding completely. In his years of military service, he had seen the darkest sides of humanity, the capacity for cruelty and destruction. The past 12 hours had been a powerful reminder that the world held wonder and connection too, even across the divide of species. The workshop door opened again as Deputy Collins returned with a woman in the dark green uniform of the state Wildlife Service. Warden Reyes was in her mid-40s with sun-weathered skin and alert, intelligent eyes that immediately assessed the scene before her. "Mr. and Mrs. Harrison," she greeted them with a professional nod. "Deputy Collins has filled me in on the basics, but I'd like to hear directly from you what happened." While Melissa tended to Emma, who was now fully awake and demanding breakfast, Jack recounted the events of the previous night, the Bobcat family appearing at their cabin, the injured mother's remarkable behavior, the confrontation with the trappers, and the treatment they had provided. Warden Reyes listened attentively, occasionally glancing at the Bobcat family, who remained calm despite the presence of a stranger. When Jack finished, she nodded thoughtfully. "In 23 years of wildlife management, I've never heard of bobcats actively seeking human assistance," she admitted. "They're typically solitary, secretive animals that avoid human contact at all costs. For a mother with cubs to approach your cabin, to allow treatment," she shook her head slightly, "it's unprecedented. Will you have to take them now?" Melissa asked, returning with Emma fed and content. "That's the protocol," Warden Reyes confirmed. "The mother needs professional veterinary care for that leg, and we need to ensure the cubs are healthy. We have transport carriers in my vehicle." At the mention of carriers, Jack noticed the mother bobcat's ears twitch, her amber eyes fixed on the warden with an intensity that suggested she understood far more than should be possible. "They won't be separated, will they?" Jack asked, voicing a concern that had been nagging at him. Warden Reyes shook her head. "We keep families together. Whenever possible, it's better for their eventual rehabilitation and release." She approached the Bobcat family slowly, her movements deliberate and non-threatening as she conducted a visual assessment. "The bandaging work is excellent," she commented, noting Melissa's handiwork. "Where did you learn wildlife first aid?" "I volunteered at a rehabilitation center before we moved here," Melissa explained. "Mostly smaller animals, but the principles are similar." The warden nodded appreciatively, then turned her attention back to the bobcats. The cubs appear healthy, good weight and clear eyes. The mother's condition is concerning. She's underweight, though that's to be expected given the injury. But considering what she's been through, she's in remarkably good shape. She straightened, making a decision. I'll bring in the carriers now. We'll need to sedate the mother for safe transport. The cubs should be manageable without sedation. As Warden Reyes stepped outside to retrieve her equipment, Melissa approached the Bobcat family one last time, Emma cradled in her arms. The mother Bobcat watched her advance, showing no signs of fear or aggression. "You're going to be okay now," Melissa told her softly. "They'll take good care of you and your babies." To Jack's continued amazement, the wild animal seemed to listen, her intelligent eyes moving from Melissa to Emma and back again. Then, as they watched, she made a soft chirping sound that brought her cubs to attention. The smallest one, the female that had approached Emma the night before, came forward again, stopping just short of Melissa's feet. "Look at that," Deputy Collins murmured from the doorway, where he had returned to observe. "It's like they're saying goodbye." The moment was interrupted by Warden Reyes returning with her equipment. 3 small animal carriers for the cubs and a larger one for the mother, along with a sedative kit. "I'll need your help," she told Jack and the deputy. "Mrs. Harrison, it might be best if you and the baby wait outside. These procedures can sometimes be stressful for the animals." Melissa nodded reluctantly, understanding the necessity but loath to leave. As she turned toward the door, the mother bobcat made a sudden movement. Not aggressive, not threatening, but deliberate. She limped forward a few steps, then sat down directly in Emma's line of sight. The baby, sensing something important, turned her head toward the bobcat. For a breathless moment, the wild mother and human infant regarded each other with a curious intensity that transcended species. Then the bobcat did something that none of them would ever forget. She dipped her head in what could only be described as a bow, her amber eyes never leaving Emma's face. Emma, in response, let out a delighted gurgle and waved her tiny hand in what seemed like a gesture of farewell. Tears welled in Melissa's eyes as she finally turned away, carrying Emma outside where they would wait for the transport to be completed. Jack remained behind with the deputy and warden to assist with the delicate process of sedating the mother bobcat and securing all 4 animals for transport. To everyone's surprise, the procedure went remarkably smoothly. The mother bobcat accepted the sedative injection with unusual compliance, as if understanding its necessity. The cubs, following their mother's example, allowed themselves to be placed in carriers with minimal fuss. "I've never seen wild bobcats this cooperative," Warden Reyes commented as they loaded the carriers into her vehicle. "It's almost as if they know we're trying to help them." "Maybe they do," Jack suggested, thinking of the intelligence he had witnessed in the mother's amber gaze. With the Bobcat family secured, Warden Reyes provided them with contact information for the Wildlife Rehabilitation Center, where the animals would be treated. "You're welcome to call for updates on their progress," she told them. "And given the unique circumstances, if you'd like to be present for their eventual release back into the wild, I think that could be arranged." "We'd like that very much," Melissa said, standing beside Jack with Emma in her arms. As the warden's vehicle pulled away, the 3 of them stood in the bright winter morning, watching until it disappeared around the bend in their long driveway. The extraordinary night had come to an end, yet Jack sensed that the experience had only just begun to work its changes on them. "Do you think we'll ever see them again?" Melissa asked quietly. Jack put his arm around her shoulders, drawing her and Emma close. "I have a feeling we haven't seen the last of that Bobcat family." The weeks that followed brought a flurry of activity to their previously quiet lives. The story of the Bobcat family seeking human help during the storm spread quickly through the community, Local news outlets picked up the story, fascinated by the unusual behavior of the wild animals and the connection they had formed with the Harrison family. Jack found himself unexpectedly thrust into a role as advocate for wildlife protection. His military background and straightforward manner made him an effective spokesperson against illegal trapping practices. When the County Wildlife Commission held hearings on strengthening penalties for poaching, he testified about their experience, his words carrying weight due to his reputation as a decorated veteran. Melissa, drawing on her previous experience in wildlife rehabilitation, began volunteering at the regional center where the Bobcat family was being treated. Her expertise with animals and her unique connection to this particular family made her a valuable addition to their team. Emma, too young to understand the significance of what had happened, nonetheless thrived in the expanding world of her parents' new activities. The quiet, somewhat isolated life they had built after Jack's return from Afghanistan was gradually opening to include a wider community of people who shared their values and concerns. Updates from the Wildlife Center were consistently positive. The mother bobcat's leg was healing well, the infection successfully treated with a course of antibiotics. The cubs were growing rapidly, their playful antics a favorite of the center's staff. Most remarkably, the family maintained their unusual comfort with human presence, though they were careful to ensure this would not hinder their eventual return to the wild. 6 weeks after that stormy night, Jack received a call from Warden Reyes. "We're planning to release the Bobcat family next week," she informed him. "A remote area of the National Forest, about 30 miles from your property, plenty of natural prey, no active trapping permits, and far from any roads or trails. Would you and your family like to be present?" "Absolutely," Jack replied without hesitation. "Just tell us when and where." The appointed day dawned clear and mild, the late winter sun hinting at the approaching spring. Jack, Melissa, and Emma followed Warden Reyes's truck along increasingly narrow Forest Service roads until they reached a small clearing surrounded by dense pine forest. "This is perfect bobcat territory," the warden explained as they unloaded the carriers from her vehicle. "Plenty of cover, good hunting grounds, and several potential den sites within a short distance." The rehabilitation center's veterinarian had accompanied them to conduct one final health check before release. He reported that all 4 bobcats were in excellent condition, the mother's leg almost completely healed, with only minimal scarring. "She'll have a slight limp in cold weather," he told them, "but it won't affect her ability to hunt or care for her cubs. She's a remarkable animal, one of the most intelligent I've ever worked with." They positioned the carriers in a row facing the forest, starting with the cubs and ending with the mother. The plan was to open them in sequence, allowing the family to reunite and move into the forest together at their own pace. A small group had gathered for the release. Warden Reyes, the veterinarian, Deputy Collins, who had remained interested in the case, and the Harrison family. Emma, now nearly 8 months old, watched with bright-eyed curiosity from her carrier. On Melissa's chest. "Ready?" Warden Reyes asked, her hand on the latch of the first cub's carrier. At Jack and Melissa's nod, she opened it, then quickly moved to the second, then the third. The cubs emerged cautiously, blinking in the sunlight, their spotted coats glossy with health. They remained near the carriers, clearly waiting for their mother. Finally, the warden opened the mother's carrier. The bobcat emerged with deliberate dignity, her amber eyes immediately assessing her surroundings. She showed no signs of fear, only alert attention as she gathered her cubs around her with gentle nudges and soft vocalizations. The assembled humans held their breath, waiting for the family to disappear into the welcoming forest. But instead of immediately, 2 months had passed since the bobcat family's release back into the wild. Spring had fully arrived in the Blue Ridge Mountains, transforming the landscape with vibrant greens and splashes of wildflower color. The Harrison family had settled back into their daily routines, though something fundamental had shifted in their relationship with the wilderness surrounding their cabin. What had once been simply a beautiful backdrop to their isolated life had become a living presence, alive with meaning and connection. Jack sat on the porch steps, sipping his morning coffee while watching Emma play on a blanket in the dappled shade. At 9 months old, she was becoming increasingly mobile, pushing herself up on hands and knees, rocking with determination as she prepared for her first real crawl. Melissa was inside preparing breakfast, the sounds of her movement in the kitchen drifting through the open windows. The peace of the morning was broken by the ringing of Jack's cell phone. He checked the screen, surprised to see Deputy Collins' name. "Morning, Deputy," he answered. "Everything all right?" "Morning, Jack," the deputy replied, his tone casual but with an undercurrent of concern. "Just checking in. We've had reports of Mike Donovan being back in the county. Thought you should know." Jack's grip tightened on his coffee mug. Mike Donovan, the bearded trapper who had threatened them the night of the storm, had managed to evade arrest when his companions were apprehended. The younger men had faced charges for illegal trapping and operating out of season, but Donovan had disappeared before warrants could be served. "Has he been causing trouble?" Jack asked, his military vigilance immediately activated. "Nothing specific. Yet, but he's been making noise at Jessup's tavern about getting even with the people who cost him his livelihood. Just wanted you to keep your eyes open, especially being so isolated out there." "I appreciate the heads up," Jack said, his gaze automatically sweeping the tree line that surrounded their clearing. "We'll be careful." After ending the call, Jack collected Emma from her blanket and brought her inside, where Melissa was setting plates on the table. "Who was on the phone?" she asked, noticing his troubled expression. Jack explained about Donovan's return as he settled Emma into her high chair. Melissa's face tightened with concern. "You think he'll come here? Try something?" Jack considered the question seriously. "Hard to say. Men like that often talk big but don't follow through. Still, we should be extra vigilant for a while. Keep the doors locked, especially when I'm not here." Melissa nodded, her expression resolute rather than frightened. Their shared experience with the Bobcat family had revealed a strength in her that continued to impress him, a quiet courage that matched his more obvious military-trained vigilance. "I'll call the Wildlife Center today," she said as she served breakfast. "See if there have been any sightings of our Bobcat family. If Donovan is back and looking for revenge, they could be targets too." Jack agreed, though privately he thought the Bobcats were likely safe in their new territory, 30 miles from their cabin. Still, the concern showed how deeply the connection with the Wild family had affected them both. They were no longer just unusual animals they had once helped, but creatures they felt responsible for, bound by an experience that defied conventional understanding. Later that morning, while Emma napped, Jack made a thorough inspection of their property. He checked the locks on all doors and windows, tested the generator that would keep essentials running if power were cut, and ensured their satellite phone was charged in case cell service was disrupted. Years of military training had taught him to prepare for contingencies, to anticipate threats before they materialized. Satisfied with the cabin's security, he walked the perimeter of their clearing, searching for any signs of intrusion or surveillance. The forest revealed nothing unusual. Birds sang, squirrels chattered, and occasionally a deer moved ghost-like through the undergrowth. Yet something felt different, a tension in the air that his combat-honed instincts recognized but couldn't precisely identify. That evening, as the sun began its descent behind the mountain ridge, casting long shadows across their clearing, Jack and Melissa sat on the porch, enjoying the mild spring air. Emma played contentedly in her portable playpen, babbling to herself as she examined a collection of colorful wooden blocks. "I spoke with Dr. Levine at the Wildlife Center," Melissa said, breaking a comfortable silence. "They haven't had any direct sightings of our bobcat family, but their tracking collar picked up signals from the mother about a week ago. They're staying within the release area, which is good news." Jack nodded, relieved, despite his earlier certainty. They're smart enough to avoid humans after what they went through with those trappers. "Except us," Melissa reminded him with a smile. "They knew we were different." Before Jack could respond, Emma made a sudden, excited sound, more animated than her usual babbling. They turned to see her pointing toward the forest edge, her small face alight with interest. Jack's hand instinctively moved toward the rifle that was never far from reach, scanning the tree line for any threat. What he saw made him freeze in astonishment. At the precise spot where the cleared land met the forest, a familiar tawny form stood watching them. The mother bobcat, her distinctive facial markings and slightly favoring right hind leg immediately identifiable. Behind her, 3 larger cubs lingered halfway in shadow, their spotted coats beginning to fade into the tawny coloration of adulthood. "Jack," Melissa whispered, her hand finding his arm. "It's them. They've come back." The mother bobcat held her position, amber eyes fixed on the human family with unmistakable recognition. She made no move to approach closer, maintaining a respectful distance that acknowledged the boundary between their worlds. Emma's excitement grew, her small hands waving as she recognized the animals from some deep, pre-verbal place in her memory. The mother bobcat's ears swiveled forward at the sound of the baby's voice, her head tilting slightly in what appeared to be recognition. 30 miles, Jack murmured in disbelief. "They traveled 30 miles through mountain wilderness to find us again." For several minutes, the two families simply observed each other across the dividing line between domestic space and wilderness. Then, with deliberate movements, the mother bobcat lowered herself to a sitting position, her cubs following suit behind her. It wasn't a posture of rest or relaxation. It was a purposeful stance, a signal. "They're keeping watch," Jack realized suddenly, his military mind recognizing the tactical positioning. The bobcats had arranged themselves with clear sight lines to both the cabin and the forest behind them, their heightened senses attuned to any approach. "You think they know about Donovan?" Melissa asked, the question not nearly as far-fetched as it would have seemed months ago. Jack shook his head, not in denial, but in wonder. "I don't know how, but I think they might be here to warn us or protect us." As the light faded from the sky, the bobcat family remained at their self-appointed post. When darkness finally enveloped the clearing completely, their forms disappeared from human sight, though Jack sensed they hadn't left. He brought Emma inside, and as Melissa prepared the baby for bed, he made one final check of the cabin's security. Before turning in, through the night, he woke several times, a soldier's habit of light sleep serving him well in uncertain situations. Each time he went to the window and scanned the moonlit clearing. Twice he caught the reflective gleam of feline eyes at the forest edge, the bobcat family maintaining their vigil through the night. Morning arrived without incident, the early light revealing dew-soaked grass and a mist rising from the forest floor. There was no sign of the bobcats, though fresh tracks at the clearing's edge confirmed they had indeed been present, not just a shared hallucination. Jack had just finished breakfast when his cell phone rang. Deputy Collins again. "Thought you'd want to know," the deputy said without preamble. "Donovan was picked up this morning trying to cross the state line. Had a bunch of illegal traps in his truck and a rifle with the serial number filed off. He's not going anywhere. For a while." Relief washed through Jack. "That's good news. Any idea what he was planning?" There was a brief hesitation on the line. That's the strange part. When they brought him in, he was babbling about being stalked by demon cats all night. Said he was heading up toward your place when something started shadowing him, making sounds that weren't natural. Got so spooked he turned around and tried to leave the county altogether. The deputy paused again. You wouldn't know anything about that, would you? Jack glanced out the window toward the forest edge where he'd last seen the Bobcat family. Can't say that I do, Deputy. Maybe his conscience was finally catching up with him. After ending the call, Jack shared the news with Melissa, who listened with wide eyes. They drove him away, she said finally. They somehow knew he was coming here and intercepted him. Jack had spent too many years in the rational world of military strategy to easily accept such an explanation, but the evidence was compelling. Somehow, the Bobcat family had not only returned to their home at precisely the moment danger threatened, but had apparently acted to neutralize that threat before it reached them. Throughout the day, there was no further sign of the Bobcats, though both Jack and Melissa found themselves frequently scanning the forest edge, half expecting to glimpse tawny fur or reflective eyes. By evening, Jack had begun to wonder if they had already returned to their territory, their self-appointed protection mission complete. As twilight descended, Melissa brought Emma out to the porch for some fresh air before bedtime. The baby had been fussy all afternoon, perhaps sensing the lingering tension in her parents. As Jack gently rocked her in his arms, trying to soothe her discomfort, a familiar chirping sound drifted from the forest edge. All three Harrison heads turned toward the sound. There, in the same spot as the previous evening, stood the mother Bobcat. This time, however, she was alone, her cubs nowhere in sight. Before Jack or Melissa could react, the wild feline began moving toward them with purposeful strides. She's coming to the cabin, Melissa whispered, amazement rather than alarm coloring her voice. Jack tensed slightly, instinctively cradling Emma more protectively. While he trusted the Bobcat's unusual intelligence and previous gentle behavior, she was still a wild predator approaching his child. Yet something in her deliberate movements communicated intent rather than threat. The Bobcat stopped about 10 feet from the porch steps, close enough that they could see the intensity in her amber eyes, the slight scar tissue visible on her right hind leg where the trap had once been. She made that distinctive chirping sound again, then lowered her head to deposit something she'd been carrying in her mouth. What is that? Melissa asked, peering at the small object now lying in the grass. Jack carefully handed Emma to Melissa and moved down the porch steps, approaching cautiously, but without fear. The Bobcat backed up several paces, maintaining a respectful distance, but making no move to flee. When Jack reached the spot where she had dropped her offering, he crouched down to examine it. It's a plant, he called back to Melissa, gently lifting the small green bundle. Some kind of herb or root. The Bobcat watched attentively as Jack examined her gift. The plant had a distinctive appearance, delicate leaves and a gnarled root, a structure that seemed deliberately unearthed rather than randomly torn from the ground. From the porch, Emma began fussing again, her earlier discomfort returning. The Bobcat's ears instantly swiveled toward the baby's cries, her attention focusing on the sound with evident interest. "Bring it here," Melissa said suddenly, a strange certainty in her voice. Jack returned to the porch, the plant still in his hand. The Bobcat followed halfway, then settled into a sitting position, watching the human family with those intelligent eyes that seemed to communicate more than should be possible. "I think I know what this is," Melissa said, examining the plant closely. "My grandmother used to gather it in these mountains. It's wild ginger root. She used it to make a tea for colicky babies." Jack looked from the plant to the Bobcat and back again, struggling to process the implications. "You're saying she brought this specifically for Emma? Because she's fussy?" Melissa nodded slowly. I think that's exactly what she did. To test the theory, Melissa took a small piece of the root inside and prepared it according to her grandmother's old recipe, steeping it carefully to make a mild tea suitable for an infant. When she offered a few drops to Emma on a small spoon, the baby accepted it readily. Within 20 minutes, her fussiness had noticeably diminished, her small face relaxing as whatever discomfort had plagued her eased. By the time they returned to the porch, twilight had deepened into true darkness. The bobcat was no longer visible, though Jack sensed she hadn't gone far. The implications of what had just happened hung in the air between them. A wild animal had not only recognized a human infant's distress, but had deliberately sought out and delivered a specific medicinal plant to address it. How could she possibly know? Jack asked, his worldview shifting beneath him like uncertain ground. Melissa rocked Emma gently, the now content baby drifting toward sleep. My grandmother always said there was old knowledge in these mountains, wisdom that passed between all living things, if you were quiet enough to hear it. She looked toward the darkness where the bobcat had disappeared. Maybe she's carrying some of that old knowledge. That night, as they prepared for bed, a gentle rain began falling, pattering against the cabin roof in a soothing rhythm. Through the open window of their bedroom, a soft, chirping call drifted up from the darkness, not distressed or demanding, but almost like a lullaby, a goodnight call from one mother to another across the divide between their worlds. Melissa paused by the window, listening to the gentle sound with a smile. She's still out there, keeping watch. Jack joined her, slipping an arm around her waist as they gazed out into the rain-washed night. I think she always will be now. The extraordinary connection formed on a desperate winter night had evolved into something neither of them could have imagined, a bridge between species, a sharing of knowledge and protection that defied conventional understanding. In saving the bobcat family, they had gained not just the satisfaction of compassion rewarded, but guardians and guides to a deeper wisdom that existed in the ancient forests around them. As they drifted toward sleep, lulled by the gentle rain and the knowledge of watchful eyes in the darkness, Jack reflected on how completely his life had transformed since returning from war. He had sought isolation and healing in these mountains, never expecting to find connection and purpose through an encounter with a wild creature who somehow recognized in him not an enemy or a threat, but a kindred spirit, another protector, who understood what it meant to risk everything for family. Summer arrived in full glory across the Blue Ridge Mountains, painting the landscape in rich greens and splashing the forest floor with wildflowers. The Harrison cabin had undergone subtle transformations as life settled into new patterns. Jack had constructed a secure play area on the porch for Emma, now 10 months old and crawling with determined enthusiasm. Melissa had planted an herb garden along the cabin's southern exposure, mixing traditional medicinal plants with culinary herbs, knowledge from her grandmother's teachings reignited by the bobcat's remarkable gift. The bobcat family had established a rhythm of visits that defied conventional wildlife behavior. They never approached the cabin during daylight hours when strangers might be present, but in the quiet of evening twilight, they would appear at the forest edge, maintaining their self-appointed vigil. Sometimes they stayed only briefly, the mother making eye contact with Jack or Melissa as if checking in before disappearing back into the trees. Other nights, they settled at the boundary between forest and clearing, watching over the human, dwelling until dawn. Dr. Levine from the Wildlife Rehabilitation Center had visited twice to observe this unprecedented behavior, taking careful notes and photographs from a respectful distance. In 30 years of wildlife biology, I've never documented anything like this, she admitted during her last visit. It challenges everything we understand about bobcat behavior. They are typically solitary, fiercely territorial, and actively avoid human contact. Maybe we should re-examine those assumptions, Melissa had suggested, watching as Emma waved enthusiastically toward the forest edge where the Bobcat family had briefly appeared before retreating from the unfamiliar human visitor. Maybe we should, Dr. Levine agreed thoughtfully. Or maybe this is simply an extraordinary exception, a unique bond formed through unusual circumstances. On this particular June morning, Jack sat at the kitchen table reviewing building plans. The publicity surrounding their Bobcat encounter had unexpectedly created new opportunities. A conservation organization had approached him about designing and constructing wildlife corridors, protected pathways that would allow animals to safely navigate between fragmented habitats. His military engineering experience, combined with his newfound passion for wildlife protection, made him uniquely qualified for the work. Melissa entered from the nursery, where she had just put Emma down for her morning nap. "The Wildlife Commission called," she said, pouring herself a cup of coffee. "They want us to speak at next month's hearing about expanding protected territories in the National Forest." Jack looked up from his blueprints. "Both of us?" "They specifically requested we present together. They said our story carries weight because of your military background and my rehabilitation experience." She smiled slightly. "Plus, people are fascinated by the ongoing relationship with the Bobcat family. It's changed how many locals view predators." It was true. Their experience had rippled outward through the community, shifting perspectives about the mountain's wild inhabitants. Even some long-time hunters had reconsidered their views after hearing about the intelligence and loyalty displayed by the Bobcat family. "I'll need to bring Emma with me to the regional center this afternoon," Melissa continued, changing subjects. "Dr. Levine wants to run those blood tests for her research on wildlife immunology. Would you mind if we take the truck? The Jeep's been making that strange noise again." Jack nodded, still focused on his blueprints. "Take the truck. I'll be working on the South Property Line survey all day anyway, marking out that new conservation easement." The conversation was interrupted by the distinctive ringtone of Melissa's phone, the Wildlife Center's emergency line. She answered, quickly, her expression growing serious as she listened. "When did this happen?" she asked, grabbing a notepad to jot down information. "How many?" "Yes, I understand. I can be there in 40 minutes. Jack looked up, recognizing the tone that meant wildlife was in trouble. "Logging accident near Miller's Ridge," Melissa explained as she ended the call. "A tree fell on a coyote den. 3 pups survived, but they need immediate care. The mother was killed." "Go," Jack said simply. "Emma will be up from her nap in about an hour. I'll stay with her while you handle the emergency." Melissa paused long enough to kiss him gratefully before grabbing her emergency veterinary kit, a recent addition to their household as her involvement with wildlife rehabilitation had deepened. 10 minutes later, the sound of their truck faded down the long driveway as she headed toward Miller's Ridge. Jack returned to his work, occasionally checking the baby monitor for sounds from Emma. The morning progressed peacefully until a strange sensation prickled the back of his neck. The combat-honed 6th sense that had saved his life more than once in Afghanistan. Something was wrong. He moved to the window, scanning the clearing and forest edge. Nothing appeared unusual. Birds sang normally, chipmunks darted across the yard, all signs of an ordinary summer day. Yet the feeling persisted, an almost tangible pressure in the air. The baby monitor crackled with the first sounds of Emma waking from her nap. Jack set aside his uneasy feeling and went to collect his daughter, finding her sitting up in her crib, babbling happily at his arrival. "Had a good sleep, little one?" he asked, lifting her into his arms. Emma responded with excited gestures toward the window, a behavior that had become common whenever the Bobcat family was present. Jack turned, half expecting to see their wild neighbors at the forest edge, but the clearing remained empty of anything unusual. "Not there right now, sweetheart. he told her, carrying her to the kitchen for lunch. As he settled Emma into her high chair, the feeling of wrongness intensified. Jack found himself checking the windows more frequently, his military alertness fully engaged. When Emma finished eating, he took her to the secured porch area to play, positioning himself where he could observe the surrounding forest while she happily explored her toys. The first tangible sign of trouble came in mid-afternoon. A peculiar silence falling over the forest. The birdsong ceased abruptly, the constant background chatter of squirrels and chipmunks vanishing as if someone had flipped a switch. Jack recognized the silence immediately. Predators were moving through the forest, disrupting the natural patterns. His first thought was of the Bobcat family, but this felt different. He had grown accustomed to the forest's reaction to their feline neighbors. This silence had a sharper edge of fear, a warning of unfamiliar danger. Jack collected Emma from her play area and brought her inside, securing the cabin doors and windows with practiced efficiency. He tried calling Melissa, but received no answer. Not unusual in the remote mountain areas where cell service was spotty at best. With Emma settled safely in her playpen, he retrieved his rifle from the locked cabinet and checked it methodically. A movement at the far edge of the clearing caught his attention. Through the window, he observed a flash of tawny fur, the mother bobcat emerging from the trees at an unusual time of day. Her appearance alone was concerning enough, but it was her behavior that sent a chill through Jack's combat-trained instincts. She was moving with purpose, her body low to the ground in a hunting posture, ears swiveling alertly as she scanned the forest edge. She paused midway across the clearing, raising her head to stare directly at the cabin with unusual intensity. Then she made a sharp, chirping sound, different from her usual vocalizations, higher and more urgent. The message was unmistakable even across species barriers. Danger. Jack moved away from the window, his mind racing through tactical options. Without knowing the specific threat, preparation was difficult, but years of military training had taught him to prioritize. First, secure Emma. Second, establish defensive positions. Third, determine the nature of the threat. He had just moved Emma to the most protected interior room when he heard it. The distinctive snap of a branch breaking under human weight, not the fluid movements of forest animals. Someone was approaching. The cabin from the north side, trying to move quietly, but lacking the skill to navigate silently through underbrush. Jack positioned himself at a window with a clear view of the north clearing, rifle ready, but not yet visible. The forest edge remained apparently empty, though his instincts told him otherwise. Then movement, not emerging from the trees, but from behind the workshop where someone had apparently circled around the property. A man stepped into view, rifle in hand, moving with deliberate stealth toward the cabin. Even at a distance, Jack recognized the bearded face and hulking form. Mike Donovan. The illegal trapper should have been in custody, awaiting trial on multiple charges. His presence here, armed and stalking the property, confirmed Jack's worst fears. But Donovan wasn't alone. A second figure emerged from behind the workshop, then a third from the tree line, the same companions from the winter confrontation. They had spaced themselves strategically around the clearing, creating multiple angles of approach toward the cabin. Jack assessed the situation with cold precision. 3 armed men with unknown intentions, though given Donovan's previous threats and current approach, their hostility was clear. Melissa was away, unreachable. The nearest law enforcement was at least 30 minutes away, assuming he could even contact them. He reached for his phone to attempt calling Deputy Collins, when Emma let out a happy squeal from her playpen. Jack froze, watching as Donovan's head snapped toward the sound, a predatory smile spreading beneath his unkempt beard. The man gestured to his companions, indicating they should spread out further, surrounding the cabin. The tactical disadvantage was severe. While Jack was confident in his ability to defend against a frontal assault, the three-way positioning created vulnerabilities. If he engaged one attacker, the others would have clear approaches to the cabin. A flash of movement drew his attention. Back to the clearing. The mother bobcat had not retreated despite the human intruders. Instead, she was slinking along the tall grass at the clearing's edge, her tawny coat providing perfect camouflage. As Jack watched in disbelief, he realized she was deliberately paralleling Donovan's movements, tracking the man who had once trapped and injured her. Then, from the opposite side of the clearing, another form emerged from the trees. One of the nearly grown cubs, its adolescent body already showing the powerful musculature of adulthood. A third bobcat appeared near the workshop, and finally, a fourth completed the circle. The entire bobcat family had positioned themselves in precise opposition to the human intruders, creating a mirrored perimeter. Jack watched in astonishment as each bobcat began pacing its section of the clearing, occasionally allowing themselves to be partially visible before disappearing again into the grass or underbrush. The effect was immediate. Donovan and his companions began casting nervous glances over their shoulders, their coordinated approach faltering as they reacted to the ghostly movements around them. Understanding dawned on Jack with startling clarity. The bobcats were deliberately disrupting the attackers' coordination, using psychological tactics to create confusion and fear. It was a hunting strategy being deployed defensively, a protection operation executed with uncanny intelligence. Donovan was the first to crack. After catching glimpses of movement from multiple directions, he fired a wild shot toward the grass where the mother bobcat had briefly revealed herself. The bullet kicked up dirt harmlessly, but the gunshot shattered the tense silence and provided Jack with the documented aggression he needed to justify his response. "Donovan!" he called out firmly from behind the partially opened window, his rifle now visible but not yet aimed directly at the man. "You're trespassing on private property and firing a weapon illegally. Drop your rifle and leave now." The bearded man swung his weapon toward the cabin, his face contorted with rage. "You cost me everything, Harrison. My business, my reputation." He fired again, this time deliberately aiming at the cabin, the bullet splintering wood beside the window frame. That single shot transformed the situation from tense standoff to active threat. Jack responded with practiced precision, firing a warning shot into the ground near Donovan's feet. "Next one won't miss," he called out, his voice carrying the absolute certainty of a combat veteran. "Drop your weapon!" For a tense moment, the outcome hung in the balance. Then, the forest erupted in a coordinated explosion of movement and sound. All four bobcats revealed themselves simultaneously, creating a perimeter of snarling, screaming felines that seemed to materialize from nowhere. The effect on Donovan's companions was electric. The youngest dropped his rifle immediately and backed away in terror, while the other began firing wildly into the grass, hitting nothing but creating chaotic noise. Donovan himself stood frozen, caught between his rage at Jack and primal fear of the creatures that seemed to be orchestrating an attack around him. That moment of indecision proved decisive. From down the long driveway came the unmistakable sound of vehicles approaching at high speed, not Melissa's truck, but the heavy engines of law enforcement vehicles. "Police! Drop your weapons!" Deputy Collins's amplified voice carried across the clearing as two county sheriff vehicles and a game warden truck skidded to a halt at the edge of the property. The youngest of Donovan's companions immediately complied, raising his hands in surrender. The second man hesitated, then followed suit as officers emerged from their vehicles with weapons drawn. Donovan alone maintained his defiant stance, rifle still clutched in white-knuckled hands. "It's over, Mike," Deputy Collins called out, advancing, cautiously with his sidearm trained on the bearded man. You're already facing enough charges to put you away for years. Don't add assaulting a federal veteran to the list." The standoff stretched for several heartbeats before Donovan finally lowered his weapon, his face a mask of frustrated rage. As the officers moved in to secure the trespassers, Jack noticed something remarkable. The Bobcat family had vanished, completely melting away into the landscape as if they had never been there. Only the trampled grass and disturbed earth marked the paths of their strategic movements. "How did you know to come?" Jack asked Deputy Collins after the three men had been handcuffed and secured in patrol vehicles. The deputy gave him a puzzled look. "Your wife called it in, said you were under attack by Donovan and his crew." He checked his notes. "Call came in about 20 minutes ago from her cell." Jack shook his head slowly. "Melissa's been at Miller's Ridge all afternoon, handling a wildlife emergency. She hasn't been back to the cabin." The deputy frowned. "That's strange. Dispatch was clear it was her name and number." The mystery deepened when Melissa herself arrived 30 minutes later, her truck bouncing up the driveway as the last police vehicle was preparing to leave. She rushed from the vehicle in obvious panic, having received multiple missed call notifications once she reached an area with cell service. "What happened?" she demanded, gathering Emma from Jack's arms and checking her over with frantic concern. "Are you both okay?" Jack explained the afternoon's events while Deputy Collins listened with increasing bewilderment. "If you didn't call in the report," the deputy asked Melissa directly. "Who did?" Melissa shook her head, confusion evident in her expression. "I've been out of cell range all afternoon. My phone's been in my bag the whole time." Later, after law enforcement had departed and the property had returned to its normal, peaceful state, Jack and Melissa sat on the porch, watching twilight descend over the clearing. Emma had been put to bed, exhausted from the day's excitement, but mercifully unaware of the danger that had threatened their home. "It doesn't make sense," Melissa said, returning to the mystery of the emergency call. "The dispatcher confirmed it came from my number, use my name, but my phone shows no outgoing calls all afternoon." Jack remained silent, his gaze fixed on the forest edge where, right on schedule, the Bobcat family had reappeared with the falling darkness. The mother sat in her usual position, amber eyes reflecting the cabin's lights, her cubs, nearly adult now, arranged in a protective semicircle. Behind her, "Maybe some things aren't meant to make sense," he finally said, "at least not in the way we normally think about the world." Melissa followed his gaze to the Bobcat family. "You think they somehow called for help?" The question hung in the air. Between them, too extraordinary to be seriously considered, yet impossible to dismiss given everything they had witnessed over the past months. "I think," Jack said carefully, "that we've been invited into a relationship with this forest and its creatures that operates on levels we don't fully understand. And I think accepting that invitation has protected us in ways we couldn't have imagined." As if acknowledging his words, the mother Bobcat dipped her head in that now familiar gesture that had come to symbolize their unusual bond. Then, with deliberate movements, she rose and led her family in a circuit around the clearing, one last patrol before they disappeared into the gathering darkness, guardians returning to their forest domain. The mystery of the emergency call was never officially resolved. Deputy Collins eventually filed it as a technical glitch, unable to reconcile the evidence with any rational explanation. But for the Harrison family, it became part of a growing collection of extraordinary events that defined their life in the mountains. Events that challenged conventional understanding, but enriched their connection to the wilderness that had become not just their home, but their community. Autumn painted the Blue Ridge Mountains in spectacular hues of crimson, amber, and gold. The forest around the Harrison cabin transformed into a tapestry of warm colors as the days grew shorter and the nights cooler. Emma celebrated her first birthday with a small gathering. Dr. Levine from the Wildlife Center, Deputy Collins and his wife, and a few neighbors who had become friends through the extraordinary events of the past year. The celebration took place on the cabin's expanded porch, which Jack had recently completed as part of their home's gradual evolution. The new space provided a panoramic view of the forest edge while remaining secure for Emma, who now toddled with increasing confidence across its wooden planks. "She's growing so fast," Deputy Collins's wife remarked, watching Emma navigate between adults with determined focus. Hard to believe she was just a tiny thing when all this started with the Bobcats. Dr. Levine nodded, her expression thoughtful. Children and wildlife both develop remarkable adaptations to their environments. Emma's being raised with an awareness of the wild that most children never experience. Indeed, Emma's awareness of their unusual neighbors had become increasingly evident. She had specific sounds and gestures she used only when the Bobcat family appeared at twilight, a private communication system that delighted and occasionally unsettled her parents with its apparent deliberateness. As the party guests departed, in the late afternoon, Melissa gathered Emma for her nap, while Jack cleared away the remnants of birthday cake and decorations. The day had been perfect. Warm sunshine, gentle breezes, and a pervasive sense of contentment that Jack had once thought he would never know again after his combat experiences. He was folding the last chair when Dr. Levine approached, her professional demeanor momentarily set aside. "I wanted to speak with you privately before leaving," she said, her voice low despite the fact that they were alone on the porch. Jack recognized the scientist's hesitation. He had seen it before when she struggled to reconcile her academic training with the unexplainable events surrounding the Harrison family and their Bobcat neighbors. "What's on your mind, Doctor?" he asked, gesturing toward the porch swing where they could sit comfortably. Dr. Levine settled onto the swing, organizing her thoughts before speaking. "The university committee has been reviewing my research proposal on your family's relationship with the Bobcats. It's causing quite a stir in academic circles." Jack had expected this. The preliminary paper Dr. Levine had published in a wildlife biology journal had generated controversy, with some colleagues embracing her observations while others dismissed them as anthropomorphism or coincidence. "And," he prompted when she paused, "they've approved continued funding but with conditions." She looked directly at him. "They want more rigorous documentation, video monitoring systems around the property, blood and tissue samples from the Bobcats if possible, standardized behavioral testing of their cognitive abilities." Jack frowned slightly. "Sounds intrusive, for us and for them." "It would be," she acknowledged. "That's why I wanted to discuss it with you privately before making any commitments. This relationship you've established defies conventional scientific understanding, but proving that to skeptical academics requires evidence that might disrupt the very thing we're trying to study." The dilemma was clear. To convince the scientific community that something extraordinary had developed between the Harrison family and the Bobcat family would require interventions that might damage that delicate connection. "What's your instinct?" Jack asked. "Not as a scientist, but as someone who's observed this firsthand." Dr. Levine's professional facade softened. "My instinct is that some things aren't meant to be dissected and categorized, that there are relationships in nature we might better honor by respecting their mystery than by trying to quantify them." She smiled ruefully. "Not very scientific of me, I know." Jack appreciated her honesty. "We'll need to discuss it with Melissa, but my inclination is to decline the intensive monitoring. We're happy to continue sharing observations and allowing occasional discreet photography, but this property is home to two families, ours and theirs. Neither should become a laboratory." Relief crossed the scientist's face. "I suspected that would be your answer. And truthfully, I'm glad. Some of my colleagues don't understand that observation sometimes yields more truth than intervention. After Dr. Levine departed, Jack found Melissa in Emma's room, watching their daughter's peaceful nap. He quietly explained the scientist's proposal and his preliminary response. "You made the right call," Melissa whispered, careful not to wake Emma. "They've trusted us. We can't betray that by turning their home into a research station." As if to confirm their decision, a familiar chirping call sounded from the forest edge, unusual for daytime hours when the Bobcat family typically remained hidden in the dense underbrush. Jack and Melissa moved to the window, scanning the tree line until they spotted the mother Bobcat positioned at the exact midpoint of the clearing. "She's alone," Melissa observed. "And out in daylight. Something must be wrong." The Bobcat's behavior was indeed concerning. She paced back and forth along the forest boundary, occasionally stopping to stare directly at the cabin with unmistakable urgency. When she detected their presence at the window, she intensified her movements clearly, trying to communicate something important. "I need to go out there," Melissa said, already moving toward the door. Jack hesitated. "Let me go first. Make sure it's not some kind of trap." Her expression softened. "Jack, after everything that's happened, do you still think she would lead us into danger?" He shook his head, acknowledging the truth. The Bobcat family had proven themselves allies and protectors multiple times. If the mother was breaking her normal patterns to seek their attention, the reason was almost certainly legitimate. "I'll get my medical kit," Melissa decided. "Maybe one of them is injured." She prepared quickly, gathering her expanded wildlife. First aid supplies while Jack checked on Emma, who continued to sleep peacefully. Together, they approached the porch, watching as the Bobcat's pacing grew more agitated upon seeing them emerge from the cabin. "We're coming," Melissa called softly, using the gentle tone she had developed for communicating with their wild neighbors. The mother Bobcat immediately turned and moved several paces into the forest, then stopped and looked back expectantly. The message was clear. "Follow me. I'll leave a note for Emma when she wakes up," Jack said, quickly returning to scribble instructions for their neighbor Sarah, who had agreed to stay with Emma after the party. The trusted friend had witnessed enough of the Harrison family's unusual relationship with the forest to understand the importance of such summons. With the note prominently displayed and Sarah alerted by phone to return to the cabin, Jack and Melissa followed the Bobcat into the forest. The wild animal maintained a careful pace, quick enough to convey urgency, but slow enough for the humans to follow easily across the uneven terrain. "She's leading us toward Miller's Creek," Jack observed after several minutes, recognizing landmarks. From his property surveys, the creek ran through a ravine about a mile from their cabin, carving a small canyon through the mountain's eastern slope. Melissa nodded, her medical kit clutched tightly as they navigated through increasingly dense underbrush. The water's usually low this time of year, but with those heavy rains last week, they fell silent as the Bobcat paused ahead, waiting for them to catch up before proceeding. There was intelligence in her patience, an understanding that her human companions lacked her agility and familiarity with the forest paths. The sound of rushing water grew louder as they approached the ravine. The normally gentle creek had indeed swollen with recent rainfall, creating small rapids that churned brown and powerful between steep banks grown slick with moisture. The Bobcat led them along the edge of the ravine for another quarter-mile before stopping abruptly. She made that distinctive chirping sound again, more insistent now, and angled her head downward toward the creek below. Jack and Melissa carefully approached the edge, peering down the steep embankment. What they saw made Melissa gasp. On a narrow ledge about 15 feet down, trapped between the rising water and the nearly vertical bank, huddled 3 coyote pups. "Those are the orphans from the logging accident," Melissa whispered in disbelief. "The ones I helped rescue this summer. They were released from rehabilitation just last week." The pups were clearly in distress, their small bodies trembling as water lapped at the edges of their precarious sanctuary. The ledge itself was eroding under the creek's unusual force, chunks of dirt occasionally breaking away to be swallowed by the churning current. How did she know? Jack wondered aloud, glancing at the bobcat who maintained her position a few feet away, watching them expectantly. "I don't know, but they don't have much time," Melissa replied, already assessing the situation with practiced urgency. "That ledge won't hold much longer." Jack quickly surveyed the ravine, his military training automatically calculating approaches and risks. "The bank's too unstable for both of us to go down. I'll lower myself with the climbing rope from my pack. Secure the pups, and you can help pull us up one by one." The plan was risky but necessary. The young coyotes would drown when the ledge inevitably collapsed, and there was no time to seek additional help. As Jack prepared the rope, securing one end to a sturdy tree trunk, Melissa laid out emergency blankets from her kit to receive the frightened pups. "Be careful," she said, helping Jack position the rope around his waist. "That bank could give way completely." With a reassuring nod, Jack began his careful descent down the slippery embankment. The soil was saturated from recent rains, making each foothold treacherous. Twice he slipped, catching himself with the rope while dislodging small avalanches of mud and rocks into the water below. The coyote pups watched his approach with terrified eyes, pressing themselves against the ravine wall as he neared their ledge. Unlike their bobcat neighbors, these young predators had no experience with human kindness, only the wariness ingrained in their species through generations of persecution. "Easy now," Jack murmured as he reached the ledge, testing its stability. With one foot before fully committing his weight, the soil crumbled ominously beneath him, forcing a quick adjustment of position. "I'm not going to hurt you." The smallest pup, perhaps remembering Melissa's gentle care during its rehabilitation, hesitantly sniffed toward Jack's extended hand. The other two remained frozen with fear, their survival instincts at war with their desperate situation. Moving with deliberate slowness, Jack extracted a small canvas bag from his pocket. "One at a time," he called up to Melissa. "I'll secure each pup and you pull them up." The rescue operation proceeded with tense efficiency. Jack managed to coax the smallest pup into the bag, securing it gently before Melissa pulled the precious cargo up the embankment. The second pup followed with slightly more resistance. As Melissa worked to calm the rescued animals wrapped in emergency blankets, Jack turned to the third and largest pup. This one showed no intention of cooperating, baring small teeth in fear as Jack approached. The standoff might have continued indefinitely if nature hadn't intervened. A large section of the ledge suddenly broke away, leaving only a crumbling platform barely larger than the pup itself. With no time for gentle persuasion, Jack lunged forward, grasping the young coyote securely despite its panicked squirming and attempted bites. The sudden movement proved too much for the remaining ledge, which disintegrated beneath his feet, plunging both human and coyote toward the rushing water below. Jack's military reflexes saved them both. As they fell, he managed to swing his body toward the embankment, one hand clutching the terrified pup while the other caught a protruding tree root. The impact against the ravine wall knocked the breath from his lungs, but he maintained his grip on both the root and the young animal. "Jack!" Melissa's panicked voice called from above. "I'm okay," he gasped, finding his footing on a narrow outcropping. "Send the rope down again." The coyote pup had gone still in his grasp, either from fear or some intuitive understanding that struggle would endanger them both further. With careful movements, Jack secured the animal in the canvas bag and attached it to the lowered rope, watching as Melissa pulled it safely to the top. His own ascent proved more challenging. The rain-soaked bank offered few secure handholds, and his earlier fall had wrenched his shoulder painfully. Halfway up, a section of earth gave way beneath his foot, leaving him dangling momentarily by the rope alone. A flash of tawny movement caught his eye as he regained his footing. The mother bobcat had descended partway down the embankment on a more stable section, her amber eyes fixed on his progress with what he could only interpret as concern. She moved parallel to his climb, somehow finding secure paths where the soil held firm, her presence oddly reassuring as he made his painful way upward. When Jack finally hauled himself over the edge to safety, he collapsed beside Melissa and the now bundled coyote pups, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The mother bobcat had already returned to the top, maintaining a respectful distance from the young coyotes while watching the entire scene with alert attention. "How did you know?" Melissa asked her directly. The question perhaps absurd to outsiders, but feeling entirely natural in the context of their unusual relationship. "How did you know they needed help?" The bobcat made no sound, but her intense gaze moved deliberately from the rescued pups to the humans and back again. A silent communication that somehow conveyed understanding across the species barrier. They gathered their equipment and prepared to carry the pups back to the cabin for examination. Jack found himself continuously glancing at their feline guide. The mother bobcat led the way home along an easier path than the one they had taken earlier, occasionally pausing to ensure they managed the terrain while burdened with their rescued charges. "She knew we helped them before," Melissa said softly, as they walked. "Somehow she knew these were the same pups I rescued after the logging accident, and she knew we would help them again." The implications were staggering, not just recognition and memory, but a complex web of connections and awareness that extended far beyond what science attributed to wildlife. The bobcat had not only recognized the coyote pups from Melissa's previous rescue work, but had somehow understood they were in danger, located them, and deliberately sought human assistance, rather than following her species' natural instinct to avoid both humans and competing predators like coyotes. When they reached the cabin clearing, Sarah met them on the porch, Emma balanced on her hip. The little girl's face lit up at the sight of her parents, tiny hands reaching eagerly toward them. "Everything okay?" Sarah asked, eyeing the bundled coyote pups with surprise. "More than okay," Jack replied, his gaze drawn to the forest edge, where the mother bobcat had paused, watching to ensure their safe return. Just another day of discovering how little we really understand about the world around us. Later that evening, after the coyote pups had been examined, hydrated, and temporarily housed in a secure enclosure in the workshop, the Harrison family gathered on their porch in the gathering twilight. Emma sat in Melissa's lap, her eyes heavy with sleep after the day's excitement. Right on schedule, the Bobcat family appeared at the forest edge, mother and nearly grown cubs arranging themselves in their customary formation. But tonight, there was a subtle difference. The mother bobcat sat slightly ahead of her family, her posture more relaxed than vigilant, her gaze fixed not on potential threats, but on the human family, with what could only be described as satisfaction. "She's proud," Melissa observed quietly. "Proud that we understood and helped when she called us." Jack nodded, the day's events settling into place within the extraordinary narrative of their interspecies relationship. What had begun as a desperate encounter during a winter storm had evolved into something science had no adequate language to describe. A conscious alliance between two families, each recognizing the other's sovereignty while acknowledging their mutual dependence. "Do you think it will always be like this?" Melissa asked, gently rocking Emma, who had finally succumbed to sleep. "This connection between us and them?" Jack watched as the mother bobcat subtly adjusted her position, amber eyes reflecting the last light of day. "I think it will evolve. As Emma grows, as the cubs become fully independent, but end. No, some bonds once formed become part of who we are." Night descended over the mountains, wrapping forest and clearing in gentle darkness. As stars appeared in the autumn sky, two families, one human, one wild, shared a moment of peaceful coexistence that challenged the boundaries of understanding, but affirmed the endless capacity for connection in a world where the lines between civilization and wilderness were perhaps more permeable than humanity had ever imagined. As seasons changed to years, Emma grew alongside the Bobcat cubs, who eventually had families of their own. The extraordinary bond between the Harrison family and their wild neighbors deepened into a multi-generational alliance, each watching over the other with unwavering loyalty. On Emma's 5th birthday, the original mother Bobcat, now graying but still regal, brought a special gift, a perfect spotted feather from a rare woodland hawk. Emma accepted it with the solemn grace of a child raised between two worlds, understanding the precious nature of their connection. Jack and Melissa documented their experiences in a book that transformed wildlife conservation practices across the country, proving that coexistence was not only possible, but profoundly enriching for both humans and wildlife. The mysterious communication that began on a desperate winter night had blossomed into a testament to the hidden possibilities that exist when we open our hearts to the wild wisdom all around us. If this extraordinary tale touched your heart, please subscribe for more stories that explore the magical connections between humans and wildlife.